So finally, we're in a position to build our news app. So this is going to be an opportunity to put together pretty much all of the skills that you've learned in this section, as well as play around with a new API. So the news website I'm going to be working with is called Hacker News. It's the news website of the Y Combinator business incubator. If you're planning your next billion-dollar startup, then they are a very good place to start. So this is one of the few news websites I read every day. Thoroughly recommend that you take a look at it. There's usually something interesting for techie types in there. Specifically though, I've chosen this one because it's got a really good and free API. And if you just search for Hacker News API, you'll get this address. But otherwise you can go to github.com/hackernewsapi. So go to that URL there and you'll get this website. So I'm just going to give you a very quick overview as to how the API works. So you can spend a bit of time reading the code here if you like. But the way that we're going to be using it is we're going to start by getting the top stories. So these are generally the most recent stories and the ones that are listed on the Hacker News homepage at the time. And if I just show you what it looks like, so if you get the contents of this URL in your app, and we know how to do that now, then you'll get this, which is just a very simple, it is JSON, but it's very simple JSON. It's just a list of numbers, and each number refers to a particular Hacker News article. So then once you've got that number, then you can use a different URL to get the actual contents of that article. And that's towards the top here. So here, for example, so this URL looks like that. So most of this stuff we don't really care about, but we're going to be displaying the title in our app, so we definitely need that. And we want the URL of the story as well. Unlike a lot of news websites, all of these links, or most of these links, actually go off Hacker News. So for example, if you want to know what the most disappointing albums are, then that's on a completely different website. So what we're going to do is fetch the list of popular articles and then get the information about each article from this page, and then we're going to get the contents of the URL as well. And we're going to save that all in a SQL database so that it's available for the user offline. And just to give you a very quick look at what we're aiming for, this is it. So Hacker News Reader, these are your stories. So this has just been loaded from the live information. And then if we tap on one of the articles, it's a little bit slow on the simulator here, but it will get there. Unfortunately, it did get it, but it looks like that particular site is down for maintenance. Probably it's got too much traffic from Hacker News. I wouldn't be surprised. So let's just have a quick look at another one. There we go. That's a little better. So we do have the full story there. So that's what we're after making. It's not straightforward. There's a lot of challenges there. And if you end up watching my video, then don't feel bad at all. It's a tough app to make. But as always, give it a shot and see how far you can get on your own. Best of luck. Hope you enjoy the process. Go for it. Okay then, hope that went well. Here we go. So we'll start, of course, with a new project. I'll call it Hacker News Reader. And our usual blank activity and usual settings. So I'm going to swap things around a little this time, and instead of starting with the user interface, I'm going to start with getting the data that we need from the Hacker News API. So this will of course require us to get some data from the web. So you'll have to dredge from your memory how we create a download task in the background using async task. So we create a public class. I'll use our usual naming convention. So download task, which extends async task. And we're going to have our usual string. We don't need to show progress, and it's going to return a string for us. Okay, we're going to get it to implement the methods for us. So that's just do in background. And this is going to be our string of URLs. And we're going to have our string result, which is initially empty. We're going to create our URL to hold our URL variable. And then we're going to have our HTTP URL connection called URL connection, which is initially null. And then I'm going to create my try and catch setup with a general exception. We'll print the stack trace of any exceptions that come up. Okay, so first of all, we'll create our URL, which is going to be a new URL from the URL which is passed to the doInBackground method, which we'll get from this var args, which is URLs, and then we want the first one, so URL 0. Then we'll set up our URL connection, which is going to be an HTTP URL connection, and we're going to get it from URL.openConnection. Then we create our good old input stream in, which we get from URL connection.get input stream. Then we create our input stream reader, which I'll call reader, which is a new input stream reader based on our input stream in. Then we create our variable data, which we'll use to read the reader. So that's equal to reader.read. And we'll keep going as long as data is not equal to -1. And then we'll create a character current, which will be the current character that's being read. And that's going to be data cast as a character. Then we're going to increment result. Well, not quite increment it, sorry, but we're going to add to it the value of the current character. And then we're just going to loop to the next character, which we do using reader.read. And then when we're done, we're going to return result. There we go. And actually, I'm going to get rid of that return result, and we're going to return result regardless. So we either get something, or if that fails, we're going to get an empty string. And then we just need to run that task on the main UI thread. Whoops. So we get that using download tasks to create a new object of this class, which we'll call task. And that's a new download task. And then we take our task and we execute it using our URL. And to get the URL, the first one that we're going to want is the one that lists all of the latest posts. So if we scroll down a little bit, I think that's this one here. So let's just check. If we take a look at that, yep. So that gives us, I think that's the 500 latest posts. We don't need all of those, but that's the data that we want. So let's get that URL in our app. And then we want to get the result there, which is going to be a string. And we'll call that result. And that could of course fail, so we should surround it with try and catch. We'll just use the defaults there, and then for now we'll just log result. Okay, don't forget to ask for the internet permission. There it is. All right, so if we've done everything correctly, that should give us what we need. So I'll run it in the same emulator I've been running the rest. And let's have a look at result. There it is. Fantastic. So we've got all the numbers that we need. Now we want to get the actual content of some of those numbers. So we'll do that here. Now we're already in try and catch. So I'm just going to create a general exception E to cover everything that could go wrong here. There's plenty of things that could go wrong. But let's then create a JSON object called JSON object to hold our data. So this is going to be a new JSON object created from the result. Actually, I'm going to change that slightly, and instead of a JSON object, we'll create a JSON array. Because this is just a very simple array. We're not going to need to extract specific items with any names or anything there. We just want to loop through the whole thing. So if that worked, we can now create an integer I and loop through it as long as I is less than JSON array dot length. Oh, I've just forgotten my I there. And then we want to increment I each time we run through the loop. And then we'll just log article ID. And the article ID is going to be JSON array dot get string and we want to get the ith string. Okay, so let's just check that. We should now find that instead of this single string, we get all of those numbers in a separate variable, which is much more useful to us. And there we go. There's all our numbers. Now I'm actually going to limit this to I being less than 20 because we only want 20 articles, we don't want 500. You can of course change that number if you want to display more or fewer articles. I think 20 is about right. Now there's a chance here of course that we'll get less than 20 articles, but if we do, then I think something will have gone more seriously wrong anyway, because there should be 500 there, and it will just give us an exception, so it won't crash the app. So you could do a check to see if the number of items in JSON array is greater than 20 or not, but I think that's a little bit superfluous to what we have here. All right, so now that we've got the article numbers that we need, let's get the content of those articles. So again, we do that using items. So this one should do it. Let's take a look. Excellent. And indeed, let's just check it with one of our IDs. So like that there, brilliant. So we're going to want the title and the URL. And each of those is going to require a new download task. So let's do that here. So we'll create a string, which I'll call article info, which is going to be task.execute, and then the URL that we want is this one, and then .get. But of course we want to change the item number to our article ID. So that's that number there. Well, I say number, it's actually a string, but we know that it's a number. Okay. So this time we do actually want a JSON object because we want to extract the title and the URL. So let's create our JSON object. So new JSON object. We're going to create it from article info. And then we're going to get the title from it using JSON object dot get string. And the string that we want is the title string. There we go. And we're also going to want the URL. I'm going to change that to article URL because I think we've already got URL somewhere. So just to keep our naming convention the same, we'll have article title as well. And this is going to be JSON object get string URL. Okay, then let's just log both of those. So article title and article title. And article info is going to be article info. There we go. I'll just undo that log there. Oops, I don't actually want article info. I want article URL. Okay then, fingers crossed, we should now get, instead of a bunch of article IDs, a bunch of article titles and article URLs, which is the exact content that we're going to want to store in our SQLite database. We've got an interesting error there, which I thought I'd leave in for you, that we cannot execute that task because the task is already running. So I think what's going on is it's executing these tasks before the previous one finishes. So what we're going to need to do to fix that is just create a new task each time. So pretty straightforward. So download task, I'll call it new task this time. Or actually we could be a bit more helpful in our article namings or in our variable namings and call it get article instead, which is going to be a new download task, and then get article instead of task. So that, with any luck, will give us what we need. Here we go. Fantastic. So we're getting a whole load of article URLs and titles there. Fantastic. Now, one thing we do have to be a little bit careful about here is that these are not necessarily going to be returned to us in the right order, because we don't know exactly how long these tasks are each going to take. So the way I'm going to deal with that is to save all of these, so the URLs and the titles, along with the IDs. So the get string part there. And then because I know that when the IDs are all in order, then these will be in order as well. So I think that makes it important enough to make article ID its own variable here. And that's going to be equal to that. There we go. So then, instead of logging these, I'm going to save them, and I'm going to save them using a map. Now, we haven't seen maps a great deal, but we did see them back at the beginning of the course and a couple of times since. So hopefully you remember roughly what they are. But if not, don't worry, I'm going to define it up here because we'll need these maps all over the place. So we'll have a map which is made up of an integer and a string. And that's going to be the article URLs. And this is going to be a new hash map of type integer and string. So the integer, of course, is going to be the article ID, and then the string is going to be the URL itself. I'm going to do the same for the titles. So integer and string, article titles. It's going to be a new hash map with types of integer and string. There we go. And finally, I'm going to have an array list of integers, which is going to be where I store the article IDs. And that's just going to be a new array list of integers. Okay, so now here, for each one of these articles, I'm going to update each of those three objects. So I'll start with article IDs. So article IDs add, and then we're going to add the article ID, but of course that's a string, so we need to convert it to an integer. So we use value of. Actually, we do that the other way around. So it's value of and then article ID. And then we do just need to get integer dot and then value of. So that will add the ID as an integer to article IDs. And then let's add article titles. So we do this taking article titles and then put. And then you can see that it's expecting an integer and a string. So the integer is, of course, article ID. And the string is going to be article title. And then, as before, we'll need to use integer dot value of for our article ID. And finally, the same thing for article URLs. Article URLs put, and then we'll do integer dot value of first this time to get the article ID as an integer. And then we want article URL. There we go. So now we're going to wait until that's all finished, and then we're going to log all of those. So article IDs and then article IDs to string, and then the same for article titles, and then article titles dot to string, and finally article URLs. There we go. So fingers crossed. We should now have everything nicely ordered in a way that we can access everything, and everything will be in order. And there we go. So there's our 20 article IDs. There's our article titles with an article ID and the title itself. And then there's the URL. Perfect. So the next stage then is to save all this information in our database. So I'm going to start by creating the SQLite database, and I'll do that up here so that it's accessible from anywhere in the main activity class. So just as we saw before, SQLite database, and I'll call it articles DB. Is going to be this dot open or create database, and I'll call the database articles. It's going to be private mode and null for our error handler. So now we've got our database. We're going to create the table if we need to, and I'll do that right at the beginning of the onCreate method. So articles DB dot exec SQL, and then we're going to create table if it doesn't exist, and I'll call the table articles, and then we have to think about what we actually want in our table. I'm going to start with an ID, because it's always a good idea to have an ID, and that's going to be an integer, and it's going to be the primary key as well. And then we'll have the article ID, which is going to be an integer. We'll have the URL, which is going to be a varchar. And the title, which is going to be a varchar. And actually later on, I'm intending to actually store the content of the article itself in here. So we'll have a varchar for the content as well. Okay, and just checking my SQL there. Okay, I think that should do it. And then here, we'll start off by just inserting each of these articles into the database. So articles DB dot exec SQL, and then insert into articles. And I'll just get that so I can see both at the same time. So we don't need to create an ID, that will be created for us automatically. But we will need an article ID, a URL, and a title. I'm going to leave the content out for now, we'll add that in later on. And then we need to state the values. So the article ID is going to be the article ID up here. And we can add it as a string because it's just a string here as part of our SQL statement, but it will be added as an integer. So I don't need to put single quotes around it. So article ID. Then we'll have the URL, which does need to have quotes. So make sure you get this just right. So article URL, and then close those quotes. And finally, article title. There we go, plus, close the single quotes, and then close the brackets, and then close the command. Okay, and then when that's all done, it would be good to just check that it's all there. So let's do a quick SQL query to get all our data and just print it to the logs. So we'll need a cursor C for articles DB, and this time we want a raw query, which is just going to be select everything from articles. Then we need an int. Whoops, I forgot my null for the error handler there. So int article ID index is c.get column index, and the column name is article ID. And we've got the same for URL index. So c.get column index URL. And finally, title index, c.get column index title. And then we move to the first result. And we loop as long as we have a result. So C is not equal to null. And I'm just going to log each of those. Call them article results. And the first one is article ID. And this is an integer, so we need to convert it to a string. And we'll use c.get int. And the int that we want is article ID index. Okay, I'm just going to copy that so I don't have to type it all out again. But this time we want article URL, and we don't need to convert it to a string this time. We can just use c.get string and then URL index. And I think this is just a little too long, which is why we're getting the errors there. So let's just change it to article ID and article URL. And then copy that one down for article title. And very important, not to forget the move to next. And I'm also going to do what I did before. I'm going to edit configurations and clear the log before launch, just so I won't have to search through the previous logs. Okay, so I've added quite a lot of SQL there, which, as we've noted before, doesn't get checked by Android Studio, so I'm hopeful that it's all going to work, but prepared for it potentially not to. And we do have a small error there, which, although the error message is not particularly useful, I think what's causing the problem is the attempt to create this database outside of the onCreate method. So I'm just going to initialize it there and then set it to the actual database inside the onCreate method, which should resolve that problem. So now it's still accessible from anywhere, but it's only been actively opened or created in code. Okay, so now we've got definitely some of them are working well. There's our JSON object being downloaded, but we do have a syntax error. Now, I had a fairly good look at my syntax and it's pretty good, but what's actually causing the problem, you can see in the error message here, it's the insert statement for this particular article. And if we scroll along, the reason this article is causing a problem is because there's a quote mark there in the title itself. So what that does is causes an error in our SQL because it thinks that this quote is the end of the string and therefore doesn't know what to do with the rest of this. Okay, so we need a way around that. And the solution we're going to use is actually quite a powerful one, and one that I'd recommend using pretty much any time that you're inserting data into the database that you don't have complete control over. So here we don't have control over what the article ID variable is, or the article URL, or the article title. So it's possible that there's some malicious code in here, and should check for that before running that code on our database. So let me show you how we solve that problem. We use something called prepared statements, which are essentially Java's way of dealing with issues like this. So first off, I'm going to take all of that code and put it into a string. So I'll call the string SQL because this is some SQL. And then I'm going to replace the variables that I've inserted there with question marks, which might look a bit mysterious, but all will become clear. So there's our SQL. So then we're going to take the string and convert it into an SQL statement. So this has a type of SQLite statement. I'll call it statement. And we get this from our DB, so from our database, so articles DB, and then we compile the statement. And we're going to compile the statement based on this string, so SQL. So really we're just turning it from a string into an SQL statement. So now we need to put our variables into that string. And we do this in a slightly odd way. We do it one by one. So we use statement.bind string, and then we put the number of the question mark that we want to replace. So we start with number 1, and then we want to replace that with article ID. So we just replace it with article ID like that. And that will replace it in such a way that firstly, we won't have to worry about those quote marks, but also it will protect us against any SQL injection code that somehow worked its way into those values. So essentially, whenever you're inserting data into your database and you don't have full control over that data, it's a good idea to use SQL statements instead. So then to replace the next one, we of course use bind string and then number 2, and that's the URL. So we're going to use article URL there. And the third one is the article title. So we use article title. There we go. And then instead of using exec SQL, we use statement.execute. So that essentially does the same thing that we did before. So it's another way of inserting data into the database, but it's a safer way. It's a way that will avoid any issues that we might have with these quotes, or indeed SQL injections. And that's looking good. Let's just do a search for article, and there we go. So now we've got all our items saved in our database. Okay, so this is looking good. One thing that I want to add in is I want to delete everything in the database before we insert these ones. Otherwise, if we run it twice, then we're going to get lots and lots of items in the database. So I'm going to do that just here. So just before we do this looping through, I'm going to take our articles DB and clear it. So we're going to execute some SQL, which is simply delete from, and then our database name, our table name, which is articles. And then that will delete everything from articles so we don't get everything more than once. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of that log for the moment because now we know that everything's getting saved into the database. So now I think we're finally in a position to get a bit of a user interface going. So that's going to firstly be a list view, which will show the titles of the articles. So let's drag in our list view. There it is. And it should give us a nice big one. Fantastic. And then we'll grab it at the beginning of onCreate. So list view, and we'll just call it list view. It's a list view, and we're going to find it by its ID, r.id.listView. Now we're going to need an array list to manage this list view, which I suspect we're going to need to access from a number of places in our code. So I'm going to define it up here. So it's going to be an array list of strings, which I'll just call titles. And that's going to be a new array list of strings. And then I'm going to connect up our list view with our array list using, of course, an array adapter, which I think I'll define up here as well. So array adapter, and then we'll use that here. So array adapter is a new array adapter using this and android.r.layout.simple_list_item1 and the titles array list. And then we'll link that up with the list view, even though it's empty at this point. So at the moment that will give us an empty table. So let's scroll down and update our table here, where we're getting all the information about the articles. I'll keep the logs just for now. But we now care about the order that these articles are going to be returned in. So we're going to use order by, and then we're going to order them by our article ID. And we want to be very sure that we get the biggest article IDs at the top because they're going to be the most recent ones. So to do that, we use DESC, which is short for descending. So this will give us all the articles in that table ordered by article ID with the biggest ones first. So as well as doing all the logging, we want to take titles and add the article title. So that's c.getString. There we go, and title index. And then once that's all done, we'll update the array adapter. So that should update the table with the content of those titles. And what I'll also do is just clear the titles array list, just to be sure that there aren't any in there before we start adding the new ones. So if we take a look at that, we should now, after probably a bit of a delay, because there's got a lot of information to download, we'll get our list view populated with 20 of the most recent titles from Hacker News. And there we go. Fantastic. So we've got our list. We could, as always, have more than 20 there if we wanted. Just need to change the number in our for loop if we did want that. All right, so We've got an app that actually does something now, which is great. Our next step, of course, is to actually display the article for the user, which means we're going to need to get the article URL. Now, there's a couple of ways we could do this. One way would be to do another query when a user taps on an item using the article title, get the URL from that. But I'm not too pleased with that because there is a chance that the article title won't be unique, and so we'd get different URLs. So unlikely. It kind of feels a bit messy doing it that way. So what I'm going to do instead is create a URLs array list to store the URLs, and we'll set it up so that the URLs have the same position in the array list as the titles do. So we can essentially use the position in the array list as a kind of secondary ID to identify the article. Okay, so we'll create another array list of strings, which is going to be URLs. And initially that's just a new array list of strings, and then we'll update that at exactly the same time that we update the titles. So urls.add c.getString, and then we want URL index. And somehow I've got getShort instead of getString. Lovely, and we'll just clear URLs there if necessary too. Okay, so now let's set up our table or our list view so that it does something on a tap. So we'll do that using list view set on item click listener. There we go. And for that we want a new on item click listener. There we go. And then here's where we want to put our code. And for now, all I'll do is log article URL. And we're going to want URLs.get, and then remember position is this variable up here, which is where they tapped in the table. All right, let's give that a shot. And actually, I think I'll get rid of all this logging down here. Now that we're fairly sure that everything's working, I don't think we'll need that anymore. Okay, here we go. So if I just tap on one of those, we get the article URL. Fabulous. So logging the article URL is all well and good, but what we really want to do is show the user the article. So of course, to do that, we're going to need a new activity, and it can be just a plain old blank activity, which for now, I'll just call your article. And to refer to it here, we'll call it article activity. And we'll give it the parent of main activity so that we've got that nice easy back button. Okay. And then what we mostly want here is a web view, which will display the whole article. So we'll match the parent for the width and the height. Wonderful. Just check the ID. It's web view. That'll be fine. Okay, so then we'll go over to article activity.java. Set up our web view. So we'll create a web view called web view, which is going to be a web view. And we're going to find it in the usual way using r.id.webview. Then we take web view and set JavaScript enabled, always a good idea. And also WebView.set WebView to a new WebView client, so we don't get that nasty Chrome redirect. And then we're going to want to load the URL, which of course means we need to be able to access the URL. So let's change our on item click code so that it passes the URL to our new activity. So we're going to need an intent called I, which is going to be a new intent using the application context, and we wanted to jump to article activity.class. Then we want to put a variable in there, so put extra, and we'll call it article URL, and we want to use this, so urls.getPosition, and then start activity using that intent. All right, now we're going to receive the URL, so that's using intent I, which is get the intent which brought us here. And then I'm going to use string URL, and that's going to be I.get string extra. And the string extra that we want, I think I'll just copy and paste that just to make sure I get it exactly right. That's article URL. Okay. Then we just want to set our web view to load the URL. And the URL that we want to load is, of course, URL. All right. Let's take a look then. We should now find that when we tap on one of those items, it jumps to the new article activity and displays the article itself in the web view. So here we go. Let's try that new Linux file system. So remember, it takes a little while to jump over. So now we're over on your article, and there it is. Not fantastically formatted for mobiles, this particular article, but it's there. Okay, so let's just jump back and check another one. Here we are. Oh, there's an SQLite one. There we go. A little bit nicer to read as well. Fabulous. So we've actually got a working app now, but we're not making the most of our database because we're not storing anything offline at the moment, or at least we're not allowing the user to view anything offline. So first off, we want to, as soon as the app loads, or as soon as the main activity is shown, we want to display the articles in the database. And we'll do that before we attempt to get any new articles. So really, we want to run the same code that we did down here. So rather than have it twice, I think we might as well make it into a method that we can access. So I'll just call it update list view, and then we'll define it here. So public void update list view. And then we can just pop everything in there. And because we've made things global variables, that should work fine. So now, if we update list view at the very start here, and come to think of it, I should definitely run update list view after we've created the database and possibly the table if we need to. I am just going to surround that with a try and catch though. Always a good idea when you're working with databases. And we'll have a general exception E as usual. Okay, so now we just need to add the update list view to our onCreate method, and I'll do it just under where the articles DB is created or opened, as the case may be. Now, when we run this, something reasonably interesting will happen. So here we go. You can see it's running. It's still taking a while. So actually, there's an interesting thing that happened there. It may look like it was doing exactly what it did before, which it more or less is, but it's doing it twice. So what it's doing is updating the list view when it should, but that update is not actually coming through to the user interface until all of this is finished, because all of this is on the main UI thread. So to get around that, we're going to need to put all of our code here into async task. So I'm just going to take the execute there, and that's all we're going to do on the main UI thread. We'll get rid of the get and just execute the task. So let's copy our code for the download task, not the part that actually executes it, but everything else. I'm going to leave update list view for the moment. And then we're going to paste that into our download task here. There we go. Now we'll get a few errors there, but that's okay. The main thing we need to update is our article info, which currently calls the async task that we're in, so we can't use that. But that's okay. We can just use some custom code to get that information. So I'm just going to keep the URL but lose everything else. And then we'll just set it up as we did before. So the URL is going to be a URL created from that string. Then we take our URL connection, and as before, get it from URL and open the connection. And then we'll take our input stream. We don't need to define it this time because it's already defined. That's just going to be URL connection.get input stream. And then input stream reader. Again, sorry, we don't need to define it. We just want to take reader and create that as a new input stream reader from our new input stream. And then we take data again and set it equal to reader.read. And then we're going to have article info. And we do need to create that this time. And that starts off as an empty string. And then we take our data, check that it's not equal to -1. And as long as that's the case, we get the current character from the data string. The data int, sorry, I should say. And then we take article info and append the current character to it. And then finally, we move data on to the next character. Okay, so now we should have our article info, which we can process in exactly the same way that we did before. Okay, so now we can go back to where this was called in onCreate. So that's here. And the important difference is that we're executing it but not getting the result. And that means we don't get that UI thread lock that we experienced there. And then we do want to update the list view. but we're going to do that in async thread. Remember, in async thread itself, or at least in the doInBackground method, we can't affect the UI in any way, but we can in onPostExecute. So remember, this method allows us to interact with the UI, and it will be called as soon as this method completes. So if we just call update list view from there, then that should update the UI when we need it to. And you can see that the list view was then populated straight away. We didn't see the update, but I suspect because everything else is the same as it was before. So it doesn't appear to update, but still it would update. And let's just add a quick log in update list view. We'll just do it down here. In fact, let's do it at the beginning, just in case. So log.i UI updated, and then done or something like that. So that will just show us when the UI has actually been updated. So you can see it's happened once. That was the initial UI update, and then it happens for the second time. Okay, so a rather major restructuring of our code there, but hopefully it made sense why that needed to happen. So essentially the lesson is try and avoid using the get in the onCreate method. We're going to be doing other things in the background as well, because that will block the updating of the UI. Okay, so we're nearly there. We have our app which updates automatically, and we can tap on each of these to view the article. There's one last thing that I mentioned that I wanted, and that was to be able to view the articles themselves offline. There's not much point being able to view this offline without being able to view the articles themselves. So we've already got a spot in our table here, as I mentioned when we created that table, called content, and that's where we're going to store the content of the URLs. Obviously we need to get that content at some point, so we'll do that in async task again. And we'll do it using this very code that we just wrote out recently. Now we have got this code a few times in our app, so we could do with probably having a separate method for it, but I'm going to keep it in just on its own, as this video is already getting fairly long. Okay, so here's where we're going to get our code for the actual content of the URL. And the URL then that we're getting now is article URL as returned by the JSON. There it is. And then instead of article info, we're going to use article content, but everything else remains the same. So article content is going to contain our article content. And then we'll just put it in with the rest of our code, just in the same way that we did before. There we go. So now article content will be saved on the database. We'll obviously need to be able to pass that to articleActivity.java, and I'm going to do it in the same way that we did with the article URL. So over in, where are we? Update list view. We're actually not using the article ID index, so we'll use content index instead. And then this is going to be content.add and then c.getString content index. There we go, and I better create the content array list. I'll do that here. Whoops, it's an array list of strings called content, and it's a new array list of strings. There we go. So as well as passing the URL, we're going to pass the article. In fact, let's just call it content. And that's going to be content.get and position. There we go. Worth pointing out that we're passing quite a lot of data here. You might consider it neater to just pass the ID or something like that and then use an SQL query to get the actual data here. Very welcome to change your app so that it does it that way instead. So here we go. So we'll get the string extra called content, and then just to test it out, instead of loading the URL, we'll load data. So the data is going to be content. The MIME type is text/HTML, same as before, and the encoding is UTF-8. Okay, so let's take a look. There is one thing to notice, that this data will not load all of the style files and JavaScript files, so it might not be as good as the actual live URL itself, in that we should have the actual article text, but it might not look great. Now, I actually left that running for a good 5 minutes or so, and it didn't download all of the content, so I suspect it would be quite a bit faster on a real device. But for now, I'm going to admit defeat, and we're just going to load the URL instead, and I'm going to comment out the parts of the code that download the article itself. Could well be that one of the articles wasn't available or was on a very slow server and that was causing problems. But either way, I think it's probably best to admit defeat for now, and we'll just have article content as an empty string in our database. So we'll just run that again to make sure that we're working okay on our new system. You're very welcome to mess about with that, and if you can run it on a real device and see if it takes as long, then do let me know in the forums. But for now, we'll just check. Here we go, that everything works okay. Let's look at those bright students left behind. Seems to be clicking through fine, and it should hopefully load that article. There we go. Wonderful. So feel free to play around with that and see if you can make the downloading of the URL content any faster. But I hope you've enjoyed making the Hacker News Reader. That takes us to the end of chapter 7. In the next chapter, we'll be making the first of the big apps in the course, Instagram, and we'll be working with Parse, which is a really powerful way to store your data online, and also gives you the option of creating push notifications and other great Android features really easily. So I hope you're looking forward to that. I'll see you there.